I want to give you a short introduction to the methodology that one uses when you study craft. What we're often doing when we look back in time at cultures and their production is history, as in art history, music history, literary history, history. What the craft field allows us to get close to is also the past, the enormous mountain of information about the ordinary lives of people, what they're using to cook with, or sleep on, or play with. And I mean this as distinct from history, the information that's been written down or documented retrospectively. To quote Hilary Mantel, the English novelist, history is not the past. It is the method we have evolved of organizing our ignorance of the past. It's the record of what's left on the record. It's the plan of the positions taken when we stop to the dance to note them down. It's what's left in the sieve when the centuries have run through it. A few stones, scraps of writing, scraps of cloth. It's no more the past than a birth certificate is a birth, or a script is a performance, or a map is a journey. It's the multiplication of the evidence of fallible and biased witnesses, combined with incomplete accounts of actions not fully understood by the people who performed them. It's no more than the best we can do, and it often falls short of that. To me, because craft often reflects all levels of society, it can actually be a better picture of the past, because it can include the ordinary and the glorified or the opulent. Archaeologists, anthropologists, makers, and historians have contributed to what we know about craft history, and I want to briefly review the four main methods that they use. Most directly is the advent of carbon dating, which came about in archaeology around 1940s. It's based on the idea that you can measure the amount of radioactive carbon isotopes in organic matter, such as this Gurzian vase from 3500 BC that we looked at last week. You can measure the amount of carbon that is coming off it relative to carbon today and be within a few hundred years of most objects. The second main method is through visual representation. This is a Greek crater from 7500 BCE, and the maker has glazed the vessel with specific information that we can then interpret. For example, in this little detail, we have images of men with weapons and large shields, horses lined up, and they're attached to chariots. And all of this activity is going on between bands of abstract patterning as well. Another example of visual representation might be something such as this baby in a high chair. This is from about 400 BCE in Greece, and it gives us information about the high chair, which looks like an egg cup upside down, the stool that the mom is sitting on, her clothes, how her hair is done, and perhaps most humanly, the fact that they are reaching for each other. This Bruegel painting from 1568, it depicts certainly the ceramic vessels that people are drinking from. And on the right is a German 16th century pass cup, a cup like the ones in Bruegel's paintings that have three handles because it makes it easier to pass around a mug and not spill anything. A painting like this also tells us about the clothing, the shoes, the accessories, the furniture, the building, the flags, the fence and how it's constructed, and musical instruments, just to name a few. Perhaps the best kind of visual representation is something like this, a matched set, if you will. This is a painting of Thomas Light, done in 1611, and he is dressed rather elegantly and also wearing this jeweled pendant in the painting. The pendant is in the possession of the Victorian Albert Museum, as is the painting, and it's here on the right, and it shows really the latest advances in the technique of faceting stones to provide more light reflection and thus more elegant. This combination like this is a great source of what is referred to as provenance. The word comes from the French, meaning from whence it comes, and it gives an idea if an object like this has been given from one family to another, it has been bought or sold, it has been lost and found, it was revised and made into a pin instead of a pendant. So it's a way of tracking objects through time with dated portraits, in this case, that show its definite date and location. The third kind of documentation is literary, and a relief like this with Nefertiti, her husband, and their daughters. It is full of hieroglyphics describing the scene as well. She and her husband are seated, their daughters are on their laps, and albeit their rather alien depiction, tall and skinny, the hieroglyphics tell us that the scene here is that Nefertiti's husband determined that he would split from general Egyptian religious practice, and instead of having multiple gods, which is referred to as polytheism, he would just make one god the supreme god, and this was the sun god. And here's the sun in the center, beaming down its rays of good fortune upon Nefertiti and her husband. Another example of literary documentation is this book written in the 5th century in current era by Copts who were Christians living in the end of the Greco-Roman Empire in Egypt and heavily persecuted at the time. The Copts still live there and have a very active Christian church life in Egypt and are still persecuted to some degree. What is particularly interesting about this object is that it is not only written in Coptic text, but in Greek as well as in Arabic, showing the overlap and crossover between three very different cultures who were cohabiting a region simultaneously. Storytelling is another great aspect of literary documentation. Myths, fables, songs, prayers, they all count as literary sources. The fourth type of method that archaeologists and anthropologists and historians use is related to literary documentation, and it's linguistics, the study of words. Cultures don't have words for things that they are not familiar with yet. There's one archaeologist who's made her career by tracing the words for felt, as in the wool bat, across Eurasia, able to pinpoint when a culture had been introduced to the material, i.e. probably introduced to sheep's wool, and then subsequently to the technique of making a functional, warm, airtight, waterproof surface out of wool itself. Additional methods that can be used to think about craft are looking at what gets saved by people. It's very hard to measure in the same way that we can measure the previous four, but it's often based on ritual and celebration, on status and power. And this example of an Aztec mask for a death cult is a perfect combination of extreme craftsmanship, eerie kind of visual impact, and linked to a death cult that would have been the highest of the nobility and the priesthood, and thus it was saved as being a very special object. It's often the luxury goods that get saved, or those that are very special, like a wedding dress or a christening gown. Symbols of power, such as this Qing Dynasty robe that we'll talk about later in the semester, but that completely encompasses all the various strains of power and authority visual information in Chinese culture. Everyday stuff tends to get tossed out. We don't see massive collections of old torn clothes and old torn bedding or broken vessels or cracked furniture in museums today. They're thrown out by those that were using them, or they're repurposed, reused, made into something new. Sometimes even archaeologists can toss stuff out. And on the right-hand side is an image from a dig in the earlier part of the 20th century wherein great cloth was found. The great cloth measured 18 feet across and 160 feet long, and it was woven as a single piece of cotton. And for you weavers thinking about this, you can understand how extraordinary that is and how that ever could have been woven as a single object. What it also shows is the bias of the archaeologists towards certain materials. It's a big piece of cloth. They didn't really see any value in it, even though it represented earlier Peruvian cultures and as well the extreme importance that cloth held in Peruvian cultures. So they cut it up into little bits and threw it out. Another way to think about these objects is to quote Alan Thompson. And for those of you who don't know Alan, he's a professor in the Jewelry Metals program. He often asks what had to exist for an object to look or work the way it does. And this can be a handy thing to think about, how to think about an object. Here we have an arrowhead on the left and an Olmec ritual adze on the right. The arrowhead certainly linked to actual survival. What had to exist had to be recognized that an animal in front of you could be killed and that you could benefit, or your family could, from being able to eat. How could you make a tool that could then enhance your ability to kill that animal? What rock should you select? What rock should you select to chip away the small, tiny amounts to make a sharp, pointed tool with which to capture your prey? On the right-hand side, what had to exist? Well, probably some pretty specifically organized ideology, gods and a hierarchy that would then dictate how this adze would have been used in a ritual sacrifice, perhaps a real sacrifice or perhaps just a performance one, but also dictate how the features of the face are being carved and what kind of stone is important for this particular ritual. Another example of an Iranian cup from 800 BCE to a Chinese export tea service from the 14th century. In terms of the teacup, there needed to be a culture which had reasonably advanced ceramic skills so that they could fire clay reliably, attach a handle reliably, and have the clay itself not be porous and thus absorbing the liquid. It would also be a culture that had some appreciation of abstract but repeating pattern as a visually enhancing component of the cup. What had to exist for this remarkable tea service would probably be the idea of trade, of desire on the part of Europeans to get their hands on this rare, wonderful material that they were unfamiliar with, that of porcelain, as well as the highly decorated details on this being conferred to the Chinese makers, them executing this with great technical mastery, and then shipping it to the West for someone's enjoyment. And one final example are netsuke. Netsuke are the small carved objects that act as a counterbalance to one's small container or purse, if you will, in a kimono. Kimono have no pockets, so you need some way to carry a few coins or tobacco, and thus the netsuke slips under the obi and hangs above. So they have to have the right mechanics, the size, the weight, where the cord hole that will be attached will be placed. It had to be material that it was available. This was often for the 16th, 17th, 18th century, often ivory that had actually been traded from India all the way to Japan and then was being used because of its particular density that it could hold and perform this function. The design also has to be smooth so it's not catching on your sleeves of your kimono or on the obi and thus still function properly. And then in addition, most netsuke have very specific cultural narratives that are contained within the depicted characters. Here there is a pearl diver called an ama who is female, and she is rather entwined with an octopus who was looking up at her. And the narrative here would have been this dangerous occupation of a female pearl diver, but the rather erotic linking of that pearl diver with the octopus, who are symbolic for the elite of Japan of the 17th and 18th century. And thus the message given would have been one of powerful men who were showing off their prowess, and this to be worn at your waist as a functional object. All of these components put objects into their cultural context: the creation, the communication, and the consumption. And we'll come back to these again and again as we go through the semester.